The boy sat in the church pew with his back very straight, and he did not move because movement had consequences. The light came through the windows of the Uppsala Cathedral in a particular way on Sunday mornings in the 1920s, slanting and cold, and it made the dust visible in the air between the pews and the pulpit where his father stood. His father's voice filled the space with the kind of authority that did not require raised volume. It simply displaced all other sound. The boy, who is called Ingmar, learned very early that there were two worlds. The one where his father's voice determined all meaning, and the one inside his own head, where images moved in sequences his father could not control. He kept the second world very quiet. The Bergman household was not unusual for a Lutheran pastor's family in Sweden in those years. There were rules about posture, about silence, about the proper way to hold a hymn book, about which thoughts were acceptable and which were evidence of moral failure. Eric Bergman, the father, believed in discipline the way other men believed in weather, as a fundamental condition of existence. Karen, the mother, was softer in manner but no less rigorous in practice. The children Ingmar had an older brother, Dag, and a sister. Margareta learned to navigate the household the way one learns to move through a house with low ceilings and sharp corners. You adjusted your movements. You did not complain about the architecture. Ingmar was a nervous child, prone to stomach ailments and nightmares. He wet the bed long past the age when this was acceptable, and the shame of it was compounded by the household's approach to shame, which was to name it clearly and then expect it to be overcome through willpower and prayer. It was not overcome. He was locked in closets as punishment. He was made to wear a red dress for a day after some infraction he later could not remember. These details appear in his own recounting, in the memoir he would write late in life, and they appear with the clarity of images that have been returned to many times, rotated in the mind until they have achieved a kind of narrative smoothness. Whether they happened exactly as he remembered is less important than the fact that he needed them to have happened that way. He was constructing, even then, even in memory, the story of a self formed by enclosure and punishment, a self that learned to live intensely in the imagination because the imagination was the only territory his father could not patrol. The church itself was his first theater. He watched his father perform the liturgy with the attention that other children reserved for circus acts. He noticed how the light changed the mood of the service. He noticed that the rituals were choreographed, that they had rhythms and silences built into them, that the congregation responded on cue. He noticed that his father, severe and unyielding at home, became something else in the pulpit, still authoritative, but now also theatrical, aware of his effect. The boy understood, without having language for it yet, that his father was playing a role, and that the role was more powerful than the man. When Ingmar was 9 years old, his brother was given a cinematograph as a gift, a magic lantern projector that could show brief loops of moving images. Ingmar wanted it more than he had wanted anything. He traded his collection of tin soldiers for it, 100 soldiers for a box and a lens and a few strips of film. It was not a fair trade by any measure, but fairness was not the point. The magic lantern was a way of making the inner world visible. He set it up in a room and projected images onto the wall, and for the first time he had the sensation that would define the rest of his life. He was not watching something, he was making something watch him. The images moved at his command. The light was his. He could repeat a sequence endlessly, or stop it mid-gesture. He could control time. He began to invent stories to accompany the images. He would narrate them aloud to himself, or to Margareta if she would sit still long enough. The stories were melodramas, ghost tales, romances, whatever the images seemed to suggest. He had no interest in realism. Reality was the house he lived in, the rules he could not escape, the father whose approval was always withheld just slightly, just enough to keep striving for it. The magic lantern was the opposite of reality. It was a rectangle of light on a wall that could contain anything. The family moved to Stockholm when Ingmar was still young, and the city opened certain possibilities. There were theaters. There were films. His grandmother, who was more indulgent than his parents, sometimes took him to the cinema, and he watched everything with a peculiar intensity, not just absorbing the stories but studying the grammar, how a cut could create meaning, how a face in close-up became a landscape of emotion, how light and shadow could make a room feel sacred or suffocating. He was particularly struck by the silences in film, the moments when no one spoke and the image simply breathed. Those silences felt like the inside of his own head. He was not a good student in the conventional sense. He was too consumed by his private obsessions. But he was a brilliant mimic. He could imitate his teachers, his classmates, his father. He discovered that performance was a form of power, that if you could make people laugh or disturb them or hold their attention, you could, for a moment, be in control of the room. He began to write little plays and stage them with whatever children he could recruit. The plays were chaotic and overlong, but they had moments of real strangeness, images he could not have explained, instincts toward the uncanny. At school, he fell in love for the first time. Her name was Marta, and she was older, unattainable, probably unaware of his existence in any meaningful way. It did not matter. The feeling was enormous and annihilating, and it gave him access to a new range of emotions that he immediately began to use in his writing. He was learning that longing was more useful than satisfaction, that the ache of wanting something just out of reach was the engine of narrative. His father's God was a God of judgment and silence. Ingmar's God, if he had one, was the God of the unanswered question, the withheld answer, the face turned away. By the time he was a teenager, he had begun to understand that he would not follow his father into the church. He had no faith, or rather, he had faith only in the power of images and the theater and the strange alchemy that happened when you put a human face in front of an audience and let them watch it think. He wanted to direct. He wanted to make the light do what he needed it to do. He wanted to create the kind of silence that his father's sermons could never achieve. Not the silence of obedience, but the silence of awe, or dread, or recognition. He studied literature at the University of Stockholm, but his real education was happening in the theaters. He haunted them. He volunteered for any role, any task. He swept floors. He painted sets. He watched directors work and absorbed their methods, their mistakes, their moments of inspiration. He was arrogant and insecure in equal measure, a combination that made him difficult but also magnetic. People found him exhausting and compelling. He talked endlessly about Strindberg, about the problem of staging interiority, about how the theater could be more than a vehicle for plot. It could be a space where the audience confronted things they did not want to confront. He began to direct small productions, student work mostly, but with an intensity that seemed out of proportion to the material. He was not interested in naturalism. He wanted heightened reality, expressionist angles, lighting that felt like a mood made visible. His early work was often too stylized, too self-consciously serious, but there were moments when everything clicked, when the actors and the lights and the text converged into something that felt necessary, and those moments were enough to keep him going. And then there was the war. Sweden was neutral, and Ingmar did not fight, but the war was everywhere in the atmosphere of the early 1940s, a pressure that made all previous concerns seem trivial or precious. He was in his early 20s, already married for the first time, a hasty, passionate, probably doomed marriage to a woman named Else Fischer, and already beginning to understand that his capacity for intimacy was not equal to his need for it. He loved intensely, and then retreated. He demanded everything from the people close to him, and gave back only the parts of himself that served the work. This was not a deliberate cruelty, or not only that. It was a kind of structural flaw, a way of being that he could see clearly in others, but not in himself. He was working in the theater constantly now, building a reputation as a director who could do extraordinary things with actors, who could find the emotional core of a scene and then strip away everything that was not essential. He had a particular gift for working with women, for drawing out performances that felt raw and undefended. Whether this was a function of his insight or his manipulation, or whether there was, in his case, any meaningful difference between the two, was a question that those women might have answered differently at different points in their lives. He also began to write, not plays only, but screenplays. The Swedish film industry was small but vital, and it needed writers and directors. Ingmar submitted scripts, and some of them were accepted. His first screenplay to be produced was called Torment, directed by Alf Sjöberg in 1944. It was a dark story about a sadistic schoolteacher and the student who defies him. And it had the seeds of many things that would obsess Ingmar for the rest of his life. The tyrant and the victim, the teacher and the student, the cruelty that masquerades as discipline, the eros that cannot be separated from power. The film was a success. Ingmar was 26 years old and suddenly visible. The Swedish film company Svensk Filmindustri offered him the chance to direct. His first film, Crisis, was released in 1946. It was not very good. It was melodramatic and stilted, the work of someone who had not yet learned the difference between theatrical staging and cinematic storytelling. But it was his, and it taught him what he needed to know, which was that film was not theater with a camera pointed at it. Film was something else entirely. It was made in the editing, in the rhythm of cuts, in the way a face could fill the frame and become a world. He directed several more films in quick succession, learning as he went. He was prolific, almost reckless, willing to fail in public if it meant he could keep working. It Rains on Our Love, A Ship Bound for India, Music in Darkness. These early films were uneven, but they showed flashes of something, a sensibility that was beginning to find its language. He was drawn to stories about people trapped by their desires, by their families, by their own natures. He was drawn to close-ups that bordered on the invasive, to faces seen in a way that made you uncomfortable, as though you were standing too close to someone in crisis. And he was learning about actors. He was beginning to understand that the right face could carry a film, that casting was not just a matter of finding someone competent, but of finding someone whose interior life was visible, whose face was a text that could be read in real time. He worked with an actor named Alf Gielen and discovered what it meant to build a performance through collaboration. He worked with Mai Zetterling and began to understand what the camera could do with a woman's face, how much could be conveyed in stillness. By the early 1950s, he was running a theater in Gothenburg and making films at the same time. He slept very little. He worked obsessively. He was married again, this time to a dancer named Ellen Lundström, and they had children, but he was absent more than he was present. The work was the marriage. The actors were the family. Everything else was secondary, a set of obligations he fulfilled imperfectly and with increasing resentment. And then, in 1953, he made Summer with Monica. It was a small film, a love story about two young people who escape Stockholm for a summer on the islands, and it should not have been as significant as it became. But something happened in the making of it. Ingmar cast an actress named Harriet Andersson, and she had a quality he had been searching for without knowing it, a combination of vulnerability and defiance, a face that could be tender and cruel in the same moment. He fell in love with her, or something like love, and the affair bled into the film. The camera watched her with an intensity that was both adoring and predatory. There was a shot, near the end, where Harriet's character looks directly into the camera, and her gaze is so direct and so challenging that it breaks the fourth wall without apology. It was as though she was looking at the audience and daring them to judge her. The film was raw and sensual in a way that Swedish cinema had not been before. It was released and caused a minor scandal, and then it found its way to France, where it was championed by the young critics at Cahiers du Cinéma. They saw in it a new kind of realism, a willingness to show physical intimacy and emotional ambiguity without moralizing. They wrote about Ingmar as though he was already a master. He was 35 years old. The success of Summer with Monica gave him leverage. He could make the films he wanted to make now, or at least he could try. He returned to the theater between film projects, directing Strindberg and Ibsen and Molière, and the two forms fed each other. The theater taught him about language and rhythm. Film taught him about silence and the image. He was beginning to see that his subject was not really plot or character in the conventional sense. His subject was the face, and what the face revealed when it could no longer hide. In 1955, he made Smiles of a Summer Night, a comedy of manners set in the turn-of-the-century world of aristocrats and servants and tangled romances. It was lighter than anything he had done, witty and elegant, and it won a prize at the Cannes Film Festival. The international film world was beginning to pay attention. Ingmar Bergman was no longer just a Swedish director. He was becoming a name. And then he made 2 films in 2 years that would define him for the rest of his life. The Seventh Seal was released in 1957. It opens with an image that entered the visual language of cinema so completely that it is almost impossible to see it now without the weight of all its subsequent references and parodies. A knight in dark armor rides along a beach with his squire. The landscape is bleak, colorless, scoured by wind. The knight dismounts and kneels by the water, and when he looks up, Death is standing there. Death is a pale figure in a black robe, and he has come to claim the knight, but the knight proposes a game of chess. If he can win or even delay the inevitable, he will have time to find some meaning, some answer to the question that has consumed him since he returned from the Crusades. Why is God silent? Why does he not answer? The film unfolds as a series of encounters. The knight and his squire travel through a Sweden ravaged by the plague. They meet a witch being burned. They meet a group of traveling actors, Jof and Mia, and their infant son who represent a kind of innocence that seems impossible in this world. They meet flagellants who whip themselves in penance. They meet death everywhere, in every form. And throughout, the knight plays his game of chess with death, moving the pieces slowly, trying to stall. The film is not subtle. It is not trying to be. It is a medieval morality play shot in black and white, with the starkness of a woodcut, and it asks its questions directly. Is there a God? If there is, why does he permit suffering? If there is not, what is the point of anything? These were not new questions, but Ingmar was asking them in a visual language that felt urgent and modern. The plague was the atomic bomb. The silence of God was the silence of a post-war Europe trying to rebuild meaning from rubble. What made the film more than an intellectual exercise was the face of Max von Sydow, who played the knight. Von Sydow had a face like a medieval saint carved in stone, and Ingmar used it the way a painter uses a particular shade of blue sparingly, precisely, for maximum effect. The close-ups of the knight's face as he questions and despairs and tries to believe are almost unbearable in their intensity. You are watching a man try to think his way to faith, and you are watching him fail. The film ends with a famous image. Death leads a line of figures in a danse macabre across a hilltop, silhouetted against the sky. The knight is among them. The squire watches from below. The actors, Joff and Mia, escape with their child. The knight has managed, in his final moments, to do one meaningful thing. He has saved the innocents. It is not much. It is not an answer, but it is something. The Seventh Seal was released, and it was immediately clear that something had shifted. This was not just a film. This was a statement about what film could do, what questions it could ask. It played at art houses around the world and became the reference point for serious cinema. Ingmar Bergman was now the serious filmmaker, the one who made movies about God and death and meaning, the one who was not afraid to be humorless, to be difficult, to demand that the audience sit in discomfort. And then, later that same year, he released Wild Strawberries. If The Seventh Seal was a medieval morality play, Wild Strawberries was a contemporary psychological study, and it was, in many ways, the warmer and more humane of the two. It follows an elderly professor, Isak Borg, on a road trip to receive an honorary degree. Along the way, he is forced to confront his past, his coldness, his failures. the people he has hurt. The film moves between present and memory, between waking life and dreams, and it treats the boundary between them as porous, unreliable. Isaac's dreams are some of the most disturbing sequences Ingmar ever filmed. A clock with no hands, a corpse that reaches out and grabs him, a vision of his own funeral. These are not symbolic puzzles to be solved. They are the texture of a mind confronting its own mortality. Victor Sjöström, one of the great Swedish directors of the silent era, played Isak Borg, and his face carried the entire film. It was a face that had lived through an era of cinema, and Ingmar used it to suggest the weight of a life, the accumulation of regrets, the small moments of grace that might redeem a person or might not. The film ends quietly, with Isak falling asleep, having arrived at a tentative peace. It is a gentle ending, uncharacteristic for Ingmar, and all the more moving for its restraint. 2 films in 1 year. One about a knight facing death and the silence of God, the other about an old man facing his own failures and finding perhaps a measure of forgiveness. Together, they established Ingmar as the filmmaker of the existential, the interior, the unanswerable. He was 40 years old, and he had arrived. But arrival is not a stable condition. He continued to make films at an almost alarming pace through the late 1950s and early 1960s, and they were, almost without exception, difficult, uncompromising, and obsessed with the same set of questions. The Magician, released in 1958, was about a traveling illusionist who may or may not have real powers, and it was also a film about the artist's relationship to the audience, about whether art is a con or a revelation, about whether there is any difference. The Virgin Spring, from 1960, was a brutal medieval tale of rape and revenge, and it won the Academy Award for Best Foreign Language Film, which gave Ingmar the kind of international prestige that allowed him to make even more uncompromising work. He was living between 2 worlds now, the theater and the cinema. He ran the Malmö Municipal Theater and directed productions there with the same intensity he brought to film. His actors moved between the 2 forms with him. He was beginning to assemble a company, a group of collaborators who understood his methods and could intuit what he needed. Gunnar Fischer, his cinematographer, knew how to light a face so that it became a landscape. Harriet Andersson, Bibi Andersson, Ingrid Thulin, these actresses became his muses, his collaborators, his mirrors. And Liv Ullmann, whom he met in the mid-1960s, became the face he would return to more than any other. But before Liv, before the late-period masterpieces, there was the trilogy. Ingmar had been circling the question of God's silence for years, but in the early 1960s he decided to confront it directly. He made 3 films: Through a Glass Darkly in 1961, Winter Light in 1963, and The Silence in 1963, that are often grouped together as a trilogy, though they do not share characters or settings. What they share is a question: what does it mean to live in a world where God does not speak? Through a Glass Darkly is set almost entirely in a single location, a summer house on a small island, and it involves 4 people: a father, his daughter, his son, and the daughter's husband. The daughter, Karen, is descending into schizophrenia, and she believes she is receiving messages from God. The film watches her unravel with a clinical precision that is also deeply compassionate. Harriet Andersson played Karen, and her performance is almost unwatchable in its intensity. You are not watching acting. You are watching someone break. The film asks whether Karen's visions are divine or merely the symptoms of illness, and it does not answer. The father, a writer, loves his daughter, but is also fascinated by her suffering in a way that is deeply suspect. He takes notes. He observes. He is making art out of her pain. Ingmar was making art out of pain as well, and he knew it, and the film is, in part, about the moral ambiguity of that act. At the end, Karen has a vision of God, but God is a spider. It is a horrifying image, and it suggests that if God exists, he might not be benevolent. He might be monstrous. Winter Light is even more austere. It follows a pastor, Thomas, who no longer believes in God but continues to perform the rituals of his faith. He is grieving his dead wife. He is involved with a school teacher, Marta, who loves him and whom he treats with cruelty. A parishioner comes to him in crisis, terrified of nuclear war, seeking reassurance, and Thomas has nothing to offer. The parishioner later kills himself. The film is set mostly in a church, and the light is cold and gray, the light of northern winter. Ingmar shoots the communion service in real time, no cuts, so you feel the duration of the ritual, the emptiness of it. The film is about a man performing gestures that have lost their meaning, and it is almost unbearable in its bleakness. And yet, at the end, Thomas decides to conduct the evening service even though no one is coming. It is a gesture of defiance or despair or something in between. The silence completes the trilogy, and it is the most radical of the three. It is set in an unnamed European city that feels like it is on the brink of war or collapse. Two sisters, Anna and Esther, and Anna's young son are staying in a hotel. Esther is dying of an unnamed illness. Anna is sensual and restless and resentful of her sister. They do not speak the same language anymore, either literally or emotionally. The film is about the failure of communication, the failure of intimacy, the failure of language itself. God is not mentioned. He is simply absent. The silence of the title is not just God's silence. It is the silence between people who can no longer reach each other. The trilogy was not warmly received by everyone. Critics found the films austere to the point of punishment. Audiences stayed away. But Ingmar was not interested in popularity. He was interested in pushing the form as far as it would go, in making films that were not entertainment but inquiries, not stories, but meditations. He was interested in what happened when you stripped away everything: plot, humor, hope, and looked at what remained. What remained almost always was the face. Ingmar's use of the close-up is one of the defining features of his work, and it is worth dwelling on because it is so extreme. He would hold on a face for seconds, minutes, longer than is comfortable, longer than most directors would dare. He would light the face so that every pore, every flicker of the eye, every micro-expression was visible. He was not interested in beauty, though many of his actors were beautiful. He was interested in legibility. He wanted to see what people were thinking, or what they were trying not to think. He wanted to see the moment when a face could no longer hold its composure. This meant that the actors had to be willing to be seen in a way that was almost clinical. B. Anderson once said that working with Ingmar was like being under a microscope. Liv Ullmann said that he made you feel like you had no secrets, that the camera saw everything. This could be exhilarating or terrifying depending on the day, depending on the actor, depending on the relationship between the actor and the director. Ingmar's relationships with his actors were intense, often romantic, always complicated. He fell in love with his actresses, or they fell in love with him, or both, and the line between the professional and the personal was never clear. Harriet Anderson was his lover in the early 50s. B.B. Anderson worked with him throughout the 60s and had a relationship with him that was intimate even when it was not sexual. Liv Ullmann became his lover and the mother of his daughter Lynn and the muse for many of his greatest films. These relationships gave the films their charge, but they also exacted a cost. Ingmar was not an easy man to love. He was self-absorbed, demanding, capable of great tenderness and great coldness, often in the same conversation. He had a way of making the people around him feel that they existed primarily in relation to his work, that their value was determined by what they could give him creatively. This was not entirely false. He did see people that way. He was aware of it, and he wrote about it in his memoir with a frankness that could seem like honesty or like self-justification, depending on how generous you were feeling. He had 6 marriages over the course of his life. He had 9 children. He was not present for many of them. He abandoned families. He moved on to the next relationship, the next film, the next obsession. His daughter Lynn, whom he had with Liv Ullmann, wrote about him with a complicated mixture of love and anger. She described a father who could be warm and playful, but who was also fundamentally unavailable, who would disappear for months, who prioritized his work above everything else. Other children said similar things. The pattern was clear. And yet, he made Scenes from a Marriage. The film was released in 1973, originally as a 6-part television miniseries, and later cut down for theatrical release. It follows a couple, Johan and Marianne, over the course of many years as their marriage falls apart. They are civilized, intelligent people who think they understand each other, and then they discover that they do not, and then they hurt each other with precision, and then they separate, and then they try to remain friends, and then they sleep together again years later, even though they are both remarried, and it is tender and sad and impossible. Liv Ullmann played Marianne, and Erland Josephson played Johan, and the film is essentially a series of long conversations between them, shot mostly in close-up, with no music, no stylistic flourishes, nothing to soften the raw exposure of two people dismantling their life together. It is one of the most painful films ever made about marriage, and it was hailed as a masterpiece of emotional realism. People watched it and saw their own marriages reflected back at them. Therapists recommended it. It played on television in Sweden, and the divorce rate reportedly went up. Ingmar was, at the time he made this film, actively failing in multiple marriages. He was living with Liv Ullmann on the island of Fur, though their relationship was already fraying. He was having affairs. He was as incapable of sustaining intimacy in his own life as Johan is in the film, and he knew it. The film is not a confession exactly, but it is not a confession either. It is a film made by someone who understands the mechanics of cruelty because he has enacted them, who understands the failure of communication because he has experienced it from both sides. Whether this makes the film more authentic or more morally suspect is a question that does not have a single answer. You can believe both things at once: that Scenes from a Marriage is a profound and humane examination of how people hurt each other, and that Ingmar Bergman was, in his personal life, someone who hurt people and did not always take responsibility for it. The work and the life do not cancel each other out. They complicate each other. Fru became his home in the mid-1960s, and it remained his home for the rest of his life. It is a small island off the coast of Gotland in the Baltic Sea, a place of stark beauty, rocky beaches, low scrub, huge skies, a kind of landscape that feels ancient and indifferent to human presence. Ingmar built a house there and a small editing studio, and he worked in isolation, or as much isolation as a famous filmmaker can achieve. He liked the austerity of the place. He liked that it was difficult to get to. He liked that the light was strange and clear, and he used that light in many of his films. Shame, The Passion of Anna, Persona, Cries and Whispers, these were all made on or round Fur, and the landscape became a character, a kind of blank canvas against which he could project interior states. Persona, made in 1966, is often considered his most radical film, and it is certainly his most enigmatic. It is about two women: an actress, Elisabeth, who has stopped speaking, and the nurse, Alma, who is assigned to care for her. They go to a house by the sea, and over the course of the film the boundaries between them begin to dissolve. Alma talks and talks, confessing things she has never told anyone, and Elisabeth listens, and the listening becomes a kind of invasion. There is a famous shot where the two women's faces are merged in a single close-up, half of each face visible, and it is unclear where one ends and the other begins. The film is about identity, performance, the instability of the self. It is also about the relationship between the artist and the subject, the director and the actor, the person who speaks and the person who listens. It is about power. Liv Ullmann played Elisabeth, and Bibi Andersson played Alma, and the two actresses were both involved with Ingmar at different points, and the film is charged with that history, that layering of intimacy and performance and exploitation. Persona is also, famously, self-reflexive. It begins with images of a film projector, of celluloid burning, of a young boy reaching out toward a screen that shows the blurred faces of the two women. It is a film that constantly reminds you that you are watching a film, that what you are seeing is constructed, mediated, not reality. And yet, the emotional impact is real. The faces are real. The confusion and the merging and the loss of self are real. Ingmar was becoming more formally adventurous in this period, more willing to break the rules of narrative cinema. Cries and Whispers, made in 1972, is a film about three sisters and a maid, set in a manor house at the turn of the century, and it is drenched in red. The walls are red, the light is red, the emotional palette is red. The emotional palette is red. It is about death and repression and the failure of love, and it is also one of the most visually stunning films he ever made. The red is not symbolic in a simple way. It is not blood or passion or any one thing. It is a saturation, an atmosphere, a way of making you feel the intensity of the world these women inhabit. The film is structured around a death. One of the sisters, Agnes, is dying of cancer, and the other two sisters, Karen and Maria, have come to be with her, though they do not know how to be with her, or with each other, or with anyone. The maid, Anna, is the only one capable of real tenderness, and there is a Piazza-like image near the end, where Anna holds the dying Agnes in her arms, and it is one of the few moments of grace in the entire film. The rest is suffering, small cruelties, the inability to bridge the gap between self and other. Ingmar shot the film in a manor house on Foro, with a small crew, in an intense and concentrated way. He was working with Sven Nykvist now, his cinematographer for most of the later films, and Nykvist understood how to create the visual texture Ingmar needed: soft light, natural light, light that seemed to come from within the image, rather than imposed on it. The close-ups in Cries and Whispers are even more extreme than in earlier films. You see every line, every tear, every flicker of despair. You see too much. You cannot look away. The film was nominated for several Academy Awards, and it confirmed Ingmar's status as one of the great filmmakers of the era, but it also marked the beginning of a period of instability. In 1976, Ingmar was arrested by Swedish tax authorities on charges of tax evasion. The charges were eventually dropped, but the experience was devastating. He was detained, humiliated, made to feel like a criminal. He left Sweden in protest and vowed never to return to make another film there. He moved to Munich and made The Serpent's Egg, a film about Berlin in the 1920s, and it was not very good. He was working in a foreign language, in a foreign system, and the film felt disconnected from the things that gave his work its power. He made From the Life of the Marionettes, another German film, and it was better, but still felt like the work of someone displaced, unmoored. He returned to Sweden eventually, though he did not make another theatrical film there for many years. Instead, he made films for television. Fanny and Alexander, released in 1982, was originally a 5-hour television miniseries, later cut down to a 3-hour theatrical version. It was, he said, his last film, though he would continue to make work for television for another 2 decades. Fanny and Alexander is unlike anything else in his body of work. It is warm, expansive, almost generous. It follows a large, boisterous family in Uppsala at the turn of the century, and it is full of life Christmas celebrations, theater performances, family dinners, ghost stories. The 2 children, Fanny and Alexander, experience the death of their father and the subsequent remarriage of their mother to a severe Lutheran bishop, and the film becomes darker, but it never loses its connection to the sensory richness of childhood, the way the world feels both magical and terrifying when you are young. The bishop is clearly modeled on Ingmar's father. He is cruel, authoritarian, convinced of his own righteousness. The household he runs is a place of silence and punishment, and the film does not forgive him. But it also shows the children escaping, returning to the world of the theater, to the warmth of their grandmother and the extended family. It is a film about survival, about the possibility of joy even in the presence of cruelty. Fanny and Alexander won the Academy Award for Best Foreign Language Film, and it was widely seen as a kind of summation of Ingmar's career, a return to the questions of his childhood, rendered with the mastery of a lifetime of making films. It was also, in a sense, a departure. It was not bleak. It did not insist on the impossibility of connection. It suggested that family, for all its failures, could also be a source of strength. After Fanny and Alexander, Ingmar continued to work, but mostly for television. He made After the Rehearsal, Sartaband, In the Presence of a Clown, and several other films that were smaller in scope, but no less rigorous. He also wrote. He published his memoir, The Magic Lantern, in 1987, and it is one of the great artist's autobiographies, though it is not a reliable document in any conventional sense. Ingmar was a storyteller, and he told the story of his own life the way he told the story of his films, selectively, with an eye toward narrative shape, willing to simplify or elide or invent if it served the larger truth he was after. The memoir is frank about his failures as a father and a husband. He writes about his affairs, his selfishness, his inability to sustain intimacy. But the frankness is also a performance. He is confessing, yes, but he is also controlling the terms of the confession, shaping it into a narrative of the tortured artist, the man who sacrificed everything for his work. Whether you accept that narrative depends on whether you believe that the work justifies the sacrifice, or whether you believe that the people who were hurt by him deserved a different accounting. He lived the last decades of his life on Frok, increasingly reclusive. He watched films, he was a voracious consumer of cinema and television, and he had opinions on everything. He wrote scripts that were never filmed. He read. He spent time with his children when they visited, though the relationships were complicated, as they had always been. He maintained a correspondence with several of his former collaborators, especially Liv Ullmann, and those letters suggest a tenderness that he was capable of in writing, if not always in person. He died on July 30th, 2007, at the age of 89. He had been ill for some time, though he kept the details private. His death was announced quietly, and the response was immediate and global. Filmmakers from around the world paid tribute. Woody Allen, who had been influenced by Ingmar more than by almost any other director, called him one of the gods of cinema. Others spoke of his rigor, his uncompromising vision, his willingness to ask the hardest questions. But there were also other voices, quieter, more ambivalent. Some of his children spoke about the cost of his greatness, the absences, the emotional neglect. Some of the women he had worked with and been involved with spoke about the complexity of their relationships with him, the ways in which he had been both inspiring and damaging. The reassessment of his personal behavior, particularly his treatment of women, has continued in the years since his death, and it complicates the legacy in ways that are necessary and uncomfortable, because the work remains. The Seventh Seal, Wild Strawberries, Persona, Cries and Whispers, Scenes from a Marriage, Fanny and Alexander. These films have not diminished. They are still taught, still watched, still argued over. They are still the reference point for a certain kind of serious cinema, the kind that insists that film can be an art form equal to literature or theater, that it can ask questions about existence and meaning and the silence of God. The close-ups remain. The faces remain. Liv Ullmann's face as she confronts the dissolution of her marriage, Bibi Anderson's face as she confesses her secrets, Harriet Anderson's face as she descends into madness, Max von Sydow's face as he plays chess with death. These images are part of the visual vocabulary of cinema now. They have been referenced, homaged, parodied, but they retain their power because they are not just images. They are records of human beings allowing themselves to be seen at the moment of extremity, and that act of being seen is both a gift and a violation. Ingmar understood this. He understood that what he was asking of his actors was enormous, that he was asking them to expose themselves in ways that were not entirely safe, that the line between artistic collaboration and exploitation was thin, and that he did not always stay on the right side of it. He understood this, and he did it anyway, because he believed that the work justified it, or because he could not help himself, or because the two are not separable. The question that remains is not whether Ingmar Bergman was a great filmmaker. He was. The question is what we do with the knowledge that great art can be made by people who are also capable of great cruelty, that the same intensity that produces a film like Persona can also produce a life full of broken relationships and hurt children. There is no easy answer. The work does not excuse the life. The life does not negate the work. They exist together, and they ask us to hold both things at once. In the years since his death, there has been a re-evaluation of the myth of the tortured male genius, the idea that artistic brilliance somehow justifies personal monstrosity. Ingmar was not a monster, but he was not a saint either. He was a man who made extraordinary films and lived an ordinary, flawed life, except that the flaws were magnified by his fame and his self-absorption and his belief that his work was the most important thing in the world. His influence on cinema is incalculable. You can see it in Woody Allen's obsession with neurosis and mortality. You can see it in the way Paul Thomas Anderson shoots faces. You can see it in the slow cinema movement, in the willingness to hold a shot long past the point of comfort. You can see it in the work of filmmakers who take seriously the idea that film can be a medium for philosophical inquiry, that it can ask the same questions that literature and philosophy ask, and that it can ask them in a language that is uniquely its own. But the influence is also a burden. Ingmar's seriousness has been both an inspiration and a trap. For every filmmaker who learned from him how to use silence and stillness, there is another who learned that seriousness means austerity, that depth means difficulty, that to be taken seriously you must reject pleasure and entertainment. This was never entirely true of Ingmar's own work. There is humor in Smiles of a Summer Night, there is sensuality in Summer with Monica, there is warmth in Fanny and Alexander. But the myth of Bergman as the grim Nordic genius, the man who made films about death and God and nothing else, has been persistent, and it has shaped the way his work is received. The late films, the ones made for television, have been less discussed but are no less remarkable. Saraband, made in 2003, reunited Liv Ullmann and Erland Josephson as Marianne and Johan from Scenes from a Marriage 30 years later. They are old now, and the film is about what remains when most of life is behind you, when the mistakes have been made and cannot be undone, when all that is left is the attempt to make peace with what you have done and who you have been. It is shot on digital video, and the texture is different from the film work, harsher and more immediate, but the concerns are the same. The face, the silence, the unbearable intimacy of two people who know each other too well. Saraband was Ingmar's last completed work, and it is fitting that it is about looking back, about reckoning. He had spent his entire career making films about people who could not escape their pasts, who were haunted by their failures and their dead, and in the end he made a film about two people who are still haunted, who are still trying to understand each other, who are still capable of tenderness even though they have hurt each other beyond repair. He wrote in The Magic Lantern that he did not believe in God, but that he believed in the power of images, in the magic lantern that had captivated him as a child. He believed that film could do something that no other art form could do. It could capture time, hold it, replay it, make you see a face the way you could never see it in real life. He believed that the close-up was a form of truth-telling, that if you watched a face long enough, you would see something essential, something that could not be faked. Whether this is true is an open question. Faces can lie. Performances are constructions. The close-up can be as manipulative as any other cinematic technique, but there is also something undeniable about the power of Ingmar's close-ups, the way they make you feel that you are seeing something you should not be seeing, that you are too close, that you should look away but cannot. This is the tension at the heart of his work, the tension between exposure and privacy, between the desire to be seen and the fear of being known, between intimacy and violation. It is the same tension that defined his personal life, the same inability to find the right distance between himself and the people he loved. He wanted to be close, but closeness terrified him. He wanted to be understood, but he also wanted to remain unknowable, in control of his own image. The films are his attempt to resolve this tension, or at least to live inside it. They are acts of exposure that are also acts of control. He shows you everything, the face in all its vulnerability, the body in its awkwardness, the soul in its despair. But he shows it to you on his terms, framed by his camera, lit by his cinematographer, edited according to his rhythms. You see what he wants you to see, and what he wants you to see is often more than you are comfortable seeing, but it is always what he has chosen to show. The silence of God, the question that runs through so much of his work, is in the end a question about meaning. If God is silent, if there is no external authority to tell you what matters, then you have to decide for yourself. You have to make your own meaning or live without it. Ingmar chose to make meaning through his work, through the films and the theater and the images, and he poured everything into that, making his intelligence, his neuroses, his cruelty, his tenderness, his fear, his ambition. The work became the answer to the silence, or at least the only answer he could give, but the work could not substitute for the life. The films could not make up for the absences, the broken promises, the children who grew up without him, the women who loved him and were hurt by him. The work was the work, and the life was the life, and they are both part of the record now. On Faro, there is a museum dedicated to him, housed in a building near his home. Visitors come to see the island where he lived and worked, to walk the beaches that appear in his films, to stand in the church where he set scenes. The island has become a pilgrimage site for cinephiles, a place to get close to the myth. But the man himself is gone, and what remains is the work, and the memory of the work, and the long arguments about what the work means, and what it cost. He made 60 films over the course of his career, and he directed approximately 170 stage productions, and he wrote several books, and he gave countless interviews, and he created one of the most distinctive bodies of work in the history of cinema. He took the medium to places it had not been before, asked questions it had not asked, showed faces the way they had not been shown. He was uncompromising and difficult and brilliant and cruel, and the films are still here, still demanding to be watched, still refusing to offer easy answers. The knight plays chess with death, and he loses, but he buys time. The professor looks back on his life and finds a moment of peace. The actor stops speaking, and the nurse speaks for her. The sisters fail to comfort each other, and the maid offers grace. The marriage falls apart, and the couple meets again years later, and it is still impossible and still tender. The children escape the bishop's house and return to the theater. These are the stories he told, over and over in different forms, with different faces, but always the same questions underneath. What does it mean to live in a world where God does not answer? What does it mean to love someone and fail them? What does it mean to see and be seen? What does it mean to make art out of suffering? And is it worth it? And who decides? He did not answer these questions. He circled them, approached them from different angles, held them up to the light and watched them refract. He made the questions visible, gave them shape and weight and duration, and then he left them with us. The films remain, the faces remain. The silence remains. And somewhere on a small island in the Baltic Sea, the light is still cold and clear and strange, and the wind is still moving across the rocks, and the house where he worked is still standing, and the projector is still, and the images are still, and the story, if there ever was one single story, has dissolved into the sound of the waves and the memory of a voice that insisted, for decades, that we look closely, that we not turn away, that we sit with the discomfort and the beauty and the silence, and that we see what there is to see, even if we do not like what find.